There is a point in every deep human bond where illusion begins to break and something more honest enters the space between two people. Most people think love starts when someone notices your beauty, your warmth, or your strengths. But Carl Jung pointed toward something far more profound. He believed real connection only begins when the masks start to fall away. At first, your soulmate does not meet your full truth. They meet pieces of you, surface impressions, moments and interpretations shaped by their own expectations. Like all human beings, they unconsciously build an internal image of who they believe you are. Jung explained that we don't just see people as they are, we project onto them what we carry inside ourselves. Our unmet needs, hidden desires, and unfinished emotional experiences quietly shape how we perceive others. In the beginning, this projection feels certain. It feels like understanding. But over time, reality slowly enters the picture. And when your soulmate begins to see the real layers of you, not the version they imagined, not the surface they first interpreted, but the deeper truth, something intense happens within them. Their inner world begins to shift. They realize that what they first thought about you was incomplete. They were not seeing the whole story. They were seeing fragments and filling in the gaps with their own imagination. And now, as truth replaces assumption, they begin to feel emotionally overwhelmed because you are not who they simplified you to be. They start to understand that your silence was never emptiness or lack of emotion. It was depth. It was reflection. Your distance was not rejection. It was self-respect and boundaries. Your mystery was not confusion. It was complexity they had not yet learned how to read. And your calm presence was not weakness. It was emotional strength shaped by experiences they never witnessed. As these realizations settle in, everything they once misunderstood begins to connect. Moments they ignored suddenly gain meaning. Conversations they dismissed now feel significant. Even small details they overlooked begin to form a clearer picture of who you truly are. True connection does not begin in admiration of perfection. It begins at the exact moment illusion dissolves and authenticity becomes unavoidable. Jung believed that most human relationships start through projection rather than truth. People meet each other not as they are, but as symbols shaped by inner longing. In the beginning, this creates excitement because imagination feels safer than reality. It is easier to love an idea than a fully complex human being, but every meaningful connection eventually reaches a point where imagination is no longer enough. The emotional mask becomes heavy, expectations begin to crack, and truth starts to surface. When your soulmate finally comes face to face with your reality, they may feel shaken, not because the truth is negative, but because it is deeper than what they were prepared for. They realize you were never the simple version they created in their mind. You were more layered, more self-aware, and more emotionally complex than they assumed. They begin to see that your silence carried thought, not absence. Your patience was not waiting blindly, but controlled emotional awareness. Your calmness was not indifference, but discipline built through inner experience. This moment can feel overwhelming because truth does something powerful to human perception. It does not only reveal another person, it reveals the observer as well. When someone finally sees you clearly, they also begin to see how they misunderstood, how they assumed, and how they filled gaps with their own expectations. They may recall moments they once overlooked. Things you said that seemed ordinary at the time now feel meaningful. Situations they misread begin to make sense from a new perspective. Awareness changes everything, and nothing feels the same anymore. Jung often described relationships as mirrors. We don't just encounter another person, we encounter ourselves reflected through them. Your soulmate may begin to realize that what they admired in you was something they lacked within themselves. Your strength may reveal their uncertainty. Your emotional stability may highlight their inner chaos. Your presence may have quietly challenged them to grow in ways they did not recognize at the time. And this realization is not always comfortable, because truth removes fantasy, and fantasy gives people a sense of control. In fantasy, everything feels predictable, but truth requires acceptance, and acceptance demands emotional maturity. There comes a point where a person must decide whether they were attached to the image they created or willing to face the real person standing in front of them. Many connections weaken here because people fall in love with their interpretation instead of reality. But deeper bonds survive because they allow illusion to dissolve. Through this process, your soulmate may begin to understand that they were not responding to your true self in the beginning. They were responding to their own projection. And now, as that projection fades, clarity replaces confusion. What remains is something more grounded, more honest, and far more real. And in that moment of recognition, they may realize something they did not expect, that seeing you clearly has permanently changed the way they understand love, connection, and even themselves. They were responding to their own expectations because in truth, your value was never dependent on their understanding in the first place. You existed completely before they ever became aware of you. Your depth, your emotional world, your quiet struggles, and the strength you built in private were always there, long before anyone recognized them. And when this realization begins to form, something uncomfortable opens inside them. They are forced to ask a question they did not expect to face. Did they ever truly know you? Or did they only ever relate to the version they constructed in their own mind? In that inner shift, the way they see you begins to change. You are no longer just an idea shaped by assumption. You are no longer a projection holding their expectations. You become a full, complex human being with layers they did not account for. And this is where something real can finally begin. Not in perfection, not in fantasy, but in the willingness to stay present when illusion no longer holds. But discovering truth is rarely peaceful at first. In fact, it can feel like emotional disruption. Carl Jung suggested that truth does not always arrive gently. More often, it enters awareness like a storm before it settles into clarity. When your soulmate begins to understand who you truly are, they are not just receiving information about you. They are experiencing a shift within themselves. It is not only that they are learning new things about you, it is that the framework they used to understand you starts to break. The mind does not like this kind of breaking. It prefers patterns that are stable, predictable, and easy to categorize. So when someone no longer fits into those categories, discomfort naturally arises. What once felt certain becomes unclear. What once felt simple becomes layered. And what they once ignored suddenly becomes impossible to unsee. At the beginning, they believed they understood your behavior. Your silence, your distance, your choices, all of it seemed easy to interpret. But as deeper understanding enters, those interpretations start to collapse. They realize your quiet was never emptiness, but thoughtfulness. Your patience was never passivity, but endurance shaped through experience. Your strength was never effortless, but built through battles they never witnessed. Even your emotional distance, which may have been judged too quickly, begins to look different now. It was not lack of feeling, it was protection, it was awareness, it was restraint built from knowing when to speak and when to stay silent. And because of that, their perception of you starts to reorganize itself completely. Jung often described this kind of shift as a confrontation between assumption and reality, between the person we think we are seeing and the truth that slowly reveals itself over time. In that process, your soulmate may begin questioning their own perception. Why did they misunderstand you? Why did they assume instead of observe? Why did certain moments only start making sense after emotional distance and reflection? These questions do not come all at once. They arrive slowly, in quiet moments, while walking alone, while remembering something you said, while noticing a pattern in themselves that they had previously ignored. It is often in silence that understanding becomes the loudest. As these questions arise, memory itself begins to change meaning. Conversations they once dismissed return with new weight. Moments that seemed small now feel significant. Even your silence, once overlooked, begins to feel full of unspoken understanding. A simple pause in conversation now feels like depth they were not ready to meet at that time. A simple reply now feels like it carried more emotional intelligence than they originally recognized. This is how awareness expands. It does not add something new. It reveals what was always there but never fully seen. Jung believed that true psychological growth happens when unconscious patterns become conscious. In this sense, what your soulmate is experiencing is not confusion, but awakening. It only feels intense because perception is widening beyond its previous limits. And anything that expands too quickly after being restricted for too long can feel overwhelming. Part of them may resist this change because old interpretations feel familiar and safe. Even if those interpretations were incomplete, they were comfortable. The mind often prefers a simple story, even if it is slightly wrong, over a complex truth that requires emotional adjustment. But another part of them understands they cannot return to that simplified version of reality. Once truth is seen clearly, it cannot be unseen. This is where internal conflict begins. One part of them wants to go back to how they used to see you, where everything felt easier to label. Another part of them starts to accept that you are not something that can be reduced into labels anymore. You are something deeper, something layered, something that requires presence rather than assumption. This is why deep connections often leave such a lasting impact. They do not only affect how we feel about another person, they change how we interpret people entirely. Your soulmate begins to notice things they previously overlooked: emotional consistency, internal discipline, quiet resilience, and depth that was never obvious at first glance. They start to realize that what they once called distance was actually emotional self-control. What they once called confusion was actually depth they had not learned to read yet. And in doing so, something even deeper happens. They begin to realize that what they are experiencing is not only discovery of you, it is discovery of themselves through you. Jung suggested that relationships act as mirrors, revealing hidden parts of our own psyche. We often believe we are simply connecting with another person, when in reality, we are also meeting aspects of ourselves we had not yet understood. So when your truth becomes clear to them, it does not only transform their perception of you, it also brings forward parts of their own emotional world they may have avoided or never fully recognized. Their reactions, their assumptions, their misunderstandings, all of it begins to reflect back at them like a mirror they cannot ignore anymore. They may begin to see their own tendency to assume instead of ask, their tendency to interpret instead of listen, their tendency to fill silence with meaning that was never actually there. And this realization can feel both humbling and disorienting at the same time. This is why the emotional experience becomes so strong. It is not just attraction or realization. It is reflection. They are not only seeing you more clearly, they are also seeing themselves more honestly in relation to you. And once that level of awareness is reached, connection can no longer remain surface level. Something deeper has already been activated, something that changes how they understand meaning, presence, and emotional truth itself. Even if they try to step back, they cannot fully return to ignorance. Even distance now carries awareness. Even silence now carries meaning. Because real understanding does not disappear when ignored. It continues to exist beneath the surface, shaping perception quietly, waiting for the moment it is acknowledged again. And in that space, whether the connection continues or pauses, something irreversible has already happened. A shift in awareness, a change in perception, a deeper recognition that truth between two people is never just about what is said, it is about what is finally seen. Parts of the self are expressed openly, and parts remain hidden in the shadows. But the shadow is not made only of darkness. It can also hold unacknowledged strength, quiet courage, unrealized dreams, emotional intelligence, and a depth that a person has not yet fully learned to accept within themselves. In many cases, what we call the shadow is not something evil or broken, but something unfinished, parts of identity that were never given permission to fully exist. When someone enters your life carrying certain qualities naturally, it creates a subtle but powerful internal reaction. Your soulmate may observe your calmness and suddenly become aware of the noise inside their own mind. They may witness your patience and notice their own restlessness. They may see your emotional stability and begin questioning why they have been depending so heavily on external validation to feel secure. What moves them is not just who you are on the surface. It is what your presence reflects back to them without you even trying. Because sometimes a person does not become unforgettable through what they say or do, but through what they awaken in another person's inner world. And that awakening is rarely comfortable at first, because awareness often arrives before understanding. Your presence may quietly challenge the way they once understood love, identity, and connection. Before meeting you deeply, they may have defined relationships through comfort, predictability, attention, and emotional certainty. But after encountering your truth, they begin to see connection differently, not as something static to possess, but as something alive that can lead to growth, awareness, and inner transformation. And growth rarely begins in comfort. It begins in the moment. Awareness starts disrupting familiar patterns. Once someone becomes conscious of something they had been avoiding within themselves, it becomes difficult to return to unconscious living. Your soulmate may begin noticing patterns in their behavior they previously justified or ignored. They may see fears hidden inside their reactions, or desires they once pushed aside because they felt inconvenient. They may recognize moments where they avoided vulnerability or mistook emotional control for emotional distance, believing that detachment was the same as strength. Carl Jung believed that true connection does not happen between two perfect individuals. It happens when two people are willing to face what is reflected back to them through each other. In that sense, relationships are not only emotional experiences, but also psychological mirrors. They reveal what is already present inside, even if it has not yet been acknowledged. That reflection is not always easy to accept because it demands honesty. It asks for awareness. It asks for responsibility. And it asks a person to stop running from themselves through distractions, routines, or emotional avoidance. So when your soulmate becomes emotionally unsettled after seeing your truth, it does not necessarily mean they are breaking down. It may mean they are finally encountering parts of themselves they have never consciously faced before. Through your presence, your authenticity, and your emotional depth, they begin recognizing aspects of their own inner world that had been waiting silently for attention. Feelings they buried begin to surface. Questions they avoided begin to form. Emotional truths they ignored start to feel impossible to dismiss in the same way they used to. At that point, the connection stops being only about emotional attraction. It begins to shift into something closer to transformation. Authenticity carries a lasting impact because it reaches places attention alone cannot reach. Carl Jung suggested that one of life's greatest challenges is becoming who we truly are rather than who we were shaped or pressured to be. Many people spend years performing versions of themselves, seeking approval, avoiding rejection, adjusting their personality to fit expectations, or behaving in ways that keep relationships stable on the surface. But this performance slowly creates distance from the real self. And over time, that distance becomes emotionally heavy. There comes a point where pretending feels more exhausting than being real, even if being real carries uncertainty. Your soulmate may have once believed that love depends on attention, pursuit, constant reassurance, or visible emotional effort. But through encountering your truth, they begin to understand something deeper. They realize your presence did not affect them because you demanded validation, but because you remained aligned with who you are, regardless of whether it was recognized or not. You did not chase understanding. You did not force recognition. You simply existed in your authenticity without reducing yourself to be more acceptable or easier to grasp. And that kind of presence is difficult to forget, because it quietly gives others permission to question their own masks. When someone meets a person who is not constantly performing for acceptance, something begins to shift within them. They start wondering how much of their own life has been shaped by fear rather than truth. They begin to question the identities they have been maintaining just to feel safe, liked, or emotionally secure. Jung described the journey toward wholeness as individuation, the process of integrating all parts of the self, rather than living through appearances alone. It is not a simple process because it requires a person to stop rejecting parts of themselves they once labeled as unwanted, uncomfortable, or unnecessary. It requires patience, self-awareness, and a willingness to face inner contradictions without immediately escaping them. Individuation often brings discomfort before it brings clarity. It can feel like emotional confusion because old beliefs about the self begin to break apart. But within that breaking, something more honest begins to form. Your soulmate may begin to realize that your value was never created by their recognition. Your depth existed long before they understood it. Your emotional world, your resilience, your quiet strength, and your inner stability were always present, even when they were not seen or acknowledged. And this realization can feel deeply unsettling because it reveals that their early perception of you was incomplete. They were not responding to the full truth of who you are, but to a limited interpretation shaped by their own emotional filters, expectations, and past experiences. Authenticity, however, cannot be easily imitated. Attention can be copied. Behavior can be performed. Attraction can be influenced. Even emotional expressions can be simulated. But authenticity carries a presence that people feel before they can logically explain it. It communicates something deeper than words, something closer to emotional truth than social interaction. That is why your soulmate may feel emotionally shaken after understanding you more clearly. They expected something simpler, something easier to categorize. Instead, they encountered depth that challenged not only their assumptions about relationships, but also their understanding of themselves. Carl Jung believed that becoming oneself is not an act of selfishness, but an act of necessity. Because only those who are rooted in their own truth can form relationships that are honest rather than performative, grounded rather than dependent, and meaningful rather than superficial. So, the deeper lesson inside this connection is not about being chosen, pursued, or validated. It is about becoming whole enough that your presence no longer requires external approval to remain real. You were never meant to shrink yourself in order to be understood. You were never meant to chase recognition in order to prove your worth. The strongest presence does not come from seeking attention, but from living in alignment with your truth, even when it is not immediately mirrored back. And when someone finally sees that truth clearly, they realize something simple yet profound, that what moved them was never perfection, never performance, and never effort designed to impress. It was authenticity, and that is what remains long after everything else fades.